All right, my friends, it's been a very long journey, but finally we are at the end of microeconomics. This is going to be our very last unit. It's called Market Failures and the Role of Government, and I just want to thank you for sticking with it. I think it's been pretty successful. You guys have done pretty well. So let's finish up strong. All right, here we go. Market failures and public goods. So again, it's been a long journey. We spent the first part of the course talking about introductory type stuff, basic type stuff like supply and demand, elasticity, that kind of stuff. We then spent a few weeks, actually more than that, talking about product markets, the four different kinds, perfect competition, monopoly, that kind of stuff. In the last unit, we jumped over to the resource market and we talked about how businesses decide what kind of resources and in what amounts to use to produce goods and services. But there's been something missing from this circular flow diagram all along, some large entity in our economy that we haven't really touched on, and that is the government. So we're going to start talking about the government and how the government relates to economics in this unit. Now, we're going to save most of our discussion about the government for macroeconomics. It's a major topic of the second semester. So here we're just going to focus on the microeconomics of what the government does, how the government affects or can affect some of the things that we've been talking about this semester. But we'll be coming back to the government quite a bit in the next semester. All right, so in terms of this semester in microeconomics, when we're talking about government, usually what we're talking about are what are called market failures. So to understand what a market failure is, I need to bring you back to the idea of the invisible hand, which I've referenced a number of times over the course of the semester. And the idea behind the invisible hand was that individual consumers and businesses pursuing their own self-interest will achieve societally optimal outcomes. That is, there was something always special about equilibrium. There was something special about going to where supply met demand. We saw that that was allocatively efficient. And one of the big, themes of microeconomics is that if you leave the free market alone, we're going to get good outcomes, quote unquote, good outcomes. In this unit, we're going to start to see that maybe that's not always entirely true. And when we don't get a good outcome, we call that a market failure. In other words, sometimes the invisible hand makes mistakes. Sometimes if we leave it to the free market, it's not going to do the thing that's best for society. Maybe that market's going to produce the wrong quantity. Maybe it's going to produce things at the wrong price from the point of view of society. And then maybe something else that we haven't really considered along the way, maybe people are hurting others in the course of production. And so this unit's kind of about how to factor that kind of stuff in and reestablish societally optimal outcomes when these kind of things happen. So for example, we might talk about the market for gasoline and the price and quantity of gasoline. But what we haven't really talked about is the fact that producing gasoline can wind up hurting other people. We saw that with the BP oil spill. So we're going to start factoring in that kind of stuff in this unit. So the first kind of market failure we're going to talk about are what are known as public goods, which aren't really a market failure. They're more of a response to a market failure. Public goods are goods or services that wouldn't be produced, or not enough of them would be produced, unless the government provided them. In other words, if we left it to the free market, the quantity that we would get would be too low from the point of view of society. Now, these are typically things that you associate the government with doing. Things like providing fire protection, national parks, street lights, that kind of stuff. So here we're going to talk about why it is that the government provides these things and why we don't simply just leave these things to the free market. The reason we don't leave these things to the free market is that these kinds of goods and services have two qualities that private goods or goods that the free market would provide in the right quantities don't have. And the two qualities that public goods have are called non-exclusion and shared consumption. To understand what these qualities are, let's compare what I'm going to call a private good to what I'm going to call a public good. Alright, so a slice of pizza would be a quintessential example of a private good. If you think about it, the first quality, exclusion, You can exclude other people from eating your pizza. If you buy a slice of pizza, you don't have to let anyone else eat it. And if someone else does try to eat it, you can have them arrested, right? That's theft. On the other hand, with public goods, it's very hard to exclude people that don't buy the product from enjoying the product. Take something like a street light. Let's say you lived on a really dark street and there was no government. If you bought a street light, you wouldn't be able to prevent the other people on your street from getting the benefit of that street light. The benefit couldn't be excluded from them. All right, so that's one quality of a public good. A public good is a good where if you purchase it, you can't exclude others from getting the benefit of it. Pizza you can, something like a street light you wouldn't be able to. The second quality is shared consumption. When a street light goes on, it lights up the street for me, and that in no way detracts from it lighting up the street from you. For you. In other words, we can share the consumption of that good. Me using that good doesn't really detract from the value of that good to you. On the other hand, with something like a slice of pizza, you can't really share the consumption. Any bite that I take is a bite that you can't take, unless we want to be really gross about the whole thing. Well, when goods have these two qualities, non-exclusion and shared consumption, private markets won't produce them or won't produce them in high enough quantities. And the reason for that is called the free rider problem. Now, even if you've never heard of the free rider problem, I'm going to suggest that you've experienced it if you've ever had any kind of group project in school. Think about every group project that you get, something that's assigned to 4 or 5 students. The same thing happens basically every single time. The project gets assigned, the 4 or 5 students sit around talking about how they're going to divide up the work, and inevitably what happens is a couple of the students wait for a couple of the other students to initiate doing all the work. Usually it's the most stressed out type A people, the people that are most conscious about their grades, that start doing the work first. Well, the problem with the group project usually is that everyone winds up getting the same grade. So you can kind of wait for other people to start doing the work, knowing that you're going to get the same benefit from it that they will. So if non-exclusion and shared consumption apply, what happens is that some people quote-unquote free ride off of the effort of others. And as a result, not enough work's going to get done. A couple of people are going to wind up doing most of the work. Well, that's the problem with public goods. If I buy a street light, non-exclusion and shared consumption means that other people can just get the benefit of my street light. And if everybody knows that, what's going to happen is that everyone's going to kind of wait around for everyone else or somebody else to buy the street light. And as a result of that, we'll get less streetlights than the market really wants. All right, well then the question is, if we're not going to leave it up to the free market, how do we decide how much of a public good to have? How do we decide how many streetlights to have, or national parks to have, or fire departments to have? With private goods and services, supply and demand told us what the right quantity was. But with public goods, it's not so simple. So if the government wants to provide the optimal amount of a public good, what it should really do is what we've been doing all along. Think about the marginal benefits and marginal costs of providing that good. That was essentially the rule for doing anything, and now we can simply apply it to how much of public good should the government provide. So we can use that same rule to determine the optimal quantity of public goods. The marginal cost the government can figure out just by figuring out what it would cost to provide the street light or the fire department or what have you. But in terms of marginal benefit, instead of leaving it up to the private market and just having people buy stuff and therefore express the benefit that they expect to receive, the government has to do it kind of through a roundabout way, through either surveys or questionnaires, or sometimes elections kind of decide what it is that that people decide benefit them. So for example, let's say the government's thinking about a new road project. There might be different kinds of roads it might choose to build. It could keep the road as is. It might choose to widen the existing road, maybe install a new 2-lane highway, a new 4-lane highway, maybe even a new 6-lane highway. Well, the government can figure out the costs of producing all those variations in the new road. And through surveys, it could also try to figure out what the benefit would be, how much this would be worth to people, how much they'd be willing to pay if they had to pay for something like that. Now, of course, as with anything else, it's not total costs or benefits that matter, it's marginal costs or benefits that matter. And again, marginal is just the change in the total. So we could figure out what the marginal benefit would be of these varying degrees of road projects. They might look something like this. Well, in this case, we would simply follow the same rule that we've always followed. Keep on producing or keep on building better roads as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost. And if that's the case, we would wind up somewhere around here. Now, this is an oversimplified example with oversimplified numbers, but this is basically the idea, that there's some goods out there that won't get produced by the private markets. The government's going to need to provide those goods. And to decide how much of those goods to provide, the government should go back to first principles about costs and benefits and comparing the marginal benefits to the marginal costs. All right, that's it for the first screencast. Next one, we're going to talk about externalities.